The Young and the Restless Spoilers Fridays full episodes August 29th, 2025. Genoa City was in one of those uneasy lulls that never last, the kind of hush that comes right before the orchestra swells. Rumors about the Abbott Communications launch were ricocheting off corporate walls. Newman Media was sniffing around a scoop it hadn't earned, and the chit-chat at society had shifted from polite to predatory. In the middle of all that noise, Nick Newman could see that Phyllis Summers wasn't just rattled shut, was unraveling by inches. She'd been playing for chessboards at once for weeks, nudging allies, warning enemies, insisting she could see around corners no one else could, until the velocity itself became the problem. One stray comment from the wrong mouth at the wrong moment came with a launch that threatened to redraw loyalties across town had left her with the sort of jittery defiance that looks like confidence from across a room and like panic up close. Nick didn't come with speeches or prescriptions. He showed up with presence. He let her pace, let her vent, let her list 1,000 tiny reasons why everyone, everywhere, was about to make a catastrophic mistake. He countered with the simplest counterweight. Calm. There was nothing to be gained from swinging at shadows, he told her. Let the launch breathe. Let the press turn itself out. Let Billy and Jack shoulder their own storms. If the truth had legs, it would still be standing tomorrow. What mattered, right now, was that Phyllis stopped burning oxygen she'd need when the dust finally settled. Across town, the Winters siblings prepared for a conversation that would not be about press releases or concept decks or nostalgic branding, but about family and trust currency that either multiplies or collapses a business before a single metric hits a dashboard. Nate Hastings had asked for it, and Lily and Devin had agreed, not because they expected to enjoy it, but because they'd spent too long letting half-truths ferment into something sour. Nate arrived without armor, no flinty charm, no executive posture. He opened with what Lily least expected and Devin most needed, specificity. He laid out how the pressure to stay indispensable had steered him toward shortcuts, how the ghosts of past betrayals had made him too fluent in rationalization, how his recent contact with Audra, however careful he had convinced himself it was, still had the shape of a conflict of interest. He didn't ask for absolution, he asked for conditions. Weekly transparency, third-party counsel on any project that so much as brushed a competitive line, and a hard stop on conversations that bled across the corporate aisle. Lily's eyes were steady as he spoke. Devin's were darker, measuring. Their response was not tender, but it wasn't ruthless either. Trust, they agreed, isn't a door you throw open. It's a lock you change, and then you decide who gets a new key. Nate left with neither a victory lap nor a scarlet letter, just a path, narrow and clearly lit. And while Nate dismantled his defenses in a small conference room, his absence echoed in a different corner of town. Audra Charles found herself across from Sally Spectre in a conversation that began with a felt-tip pen sketch of the Abbott Communications launch and pivoted, unexpectedly, to heart triage. Audra relayed the confession she knew was happening in real time, and the small, embarrassing truth behind it. She wanted to fix it and knew she couldn't. The old Audrey, one who could make information dance, would have pressed, prodded, manipulated the silence until it confessed what the man would not. But this version had learned something about the difference between influence and intimacy. I think the only move is no move, she admitted, and the sentence sounded foreign even to her. Space. Let the air clear. If there's gravity here, he'll feel it when we're not performing. Sally, who'd built and rebuilt a career out of staging the room, surprised her by agreeing. Then she did what she does. She redirected their attention to the work, the stage set that would be the city's next obsession. Abbott Communications would not debut as a chest-thumping tech rollout, but as a love letter to mid-century television, the cadence of live broadcasts, the elegance of studio cards, the intimacy of a sponsor's jingle you could hum from memory. Nostalgia wasn't an escape hatch, it was a strategy. In a market drunk on disruption, they would deliver comfort with teeth. Still, strategy rarely survives contact with people. Audra's confidence in her own executive skin flickered the moment the words CEO of an Abbott-owned company rolled across her mind with their full weight. Ownership families write the weather, she thought, and CEOs are expected to predict it in public. Sally, catching the hesitation, didn't waste time with flattery. She went surgical. The theme buys you moral authority, she said. It says you understand legacy, respect craft, and know where the ladders were built. Use it. Build a launch that makes the shareholders nostalgic and the city proud. Then anchor your tenure in the one thing both of those constituencies actually worship: clarity. Publish your governance. Over-disclose. Get a board committee chaired by someone who does not share your last name. And if the Abbott last name ever leans on you, make sure everyone can see it. Sunlight is the only antidote to dynasty. Audra did not smile, but her shoulders loosened at the peculiar relief of a plan that depends less on hope than on habits. Billy Abbott, unsurprisingly, was not in the mood for habits. He was at home, mid-call with a logistics lead about camera sightlines for the retro set, when a knock interrupted. He opened the door expecting a courier and got Kane Ashby and Dunenvidit, unannounced, and carrying news like a live wire in his pocket. Surprise was Billy's first expression. Caution was his second. The last time these two shared air without witnesses, restraint had broken its ankle. Tell me it's good, Billy ventured, with a cynicism that implied he'd be satisfied if it was merely not catastrophic. Depends on your loyalty, Kane said, and the phrase landed like a gauntlet on hardwood. Billy could have laughed it off if not for the next thought that sheaved its way out. Why, exactly, would Kane care whether Billy stayed loyal to anything? Phyllis says I'm out, Billy added, half snarl, half shrug, daring the universe to contradict one of Phyllis's more performative prophecies. Kane didn't blink. That's her wish casting, he said, with a dry little smile that made Billy want to end the meeting before it began. Wish casting, trust drift, nostalgia with teeth of Irian in this town was naming weather patterns like they were givens, when all any of them had were guesses dressed up as wisdom. Kane's headline was simple, or at least it pretended to be. His highly rumored return to Genoa City as a permanent, press-conferenced, power suit fixture was off. The statement was so stark it sounded like a bluff, so Billy stripped it for pariahs. Did off mean never or not now? Did return mean to a board, to a family, to a feud? Kane let the questions hover and then shaped them. He had stepped away from the optics of a triumphant re-entry, no staged photo ops, no choreographed grins, no smug public narrative about a reformed man ready to serve. He canceled the announcement, the rollout, the performance. What he hadn't canceled was the quiet part, his conversations, his due diligence, his private recalibrations that would still ripple through the same quarters whether or not a camera was rolling. The message underneath the message was the one that mattered. He was removing the target without abandoning the terrain. So you came here to warn me, Billy said. I came here to see which way your weather vane's pointing before the wind hits, Kane answered, and even he seemed a little surprised by his candor. Nick's second pass at stabilizing Phyllis was more subtle and more effective. He didn't argue with her picture of the battlefield. He redrew its borders. If she was convinced the launch would be used as a referendum on her instincts, find them the most subversive move she could make was to let it happen without her fingerprints on every frame. If she believed Billy and Jack were susceptible to flattery one minute and to panic the next, then the only meaningful influence she could exert was to refuse to give them the panic they expected. He divided her universe into two columns, things she could shape and things she could survive. It wasn't a pep talk, it was triage. She hated him for it and loved him for it in the same breath. By the time he left, the edges of her panic had rounded into resolve. She texted 3 apologies and 1 thank you and deleted a draft message that would have put kerosene on an ember. She didn't become a different person. She became the version of herself who remembers how to wait. And waiting is what Nate, improbably, had chosen too. He didn't text Audra a treatise or a lifeline. He sent the only thing that carries the dignity of restraint. A short update that said the talk happened, the work continues, and the door isn't locked, but it isn't swinging either. Audra could respect that. It gave her the assignment Sally had already suggested make the work unimpeachable. She threw herself into the 1950s concept with a zeal that would have looked performative if the artifacts of it weren't so precise. Her team pulled title cards from network archives and re-inked them by hand. They sourced cameras not to pretend they were live, but to make modern frames breathe like they were. They auditioned voiceover artists until the vowels carried the right blend of intimacy and authority. They didn't do it to be cute. They did it to teach an audience how to trust the signal again. Sally, meanwhile, didn't just intervene on Audra's anxieties. She intervened on the narrative perimeter of the launch. She built a press kit that did not brag. It educated with nostalgia now. Why this company? Why this city? She seeded profiles with the kind of details that make critics feel as though they discovered the story themselves. She found the beat reporters who still write in sentences instead of clicks and gave them a reason to remember how. And because she knows how gossip metastasizes, she put quiet boundaries around the one subplot that could cannibalize the whole evening. Any chatter about whether Billy was in or out would be starved of oxygen by a program that left no empty spaces for speculation to breed. You don't silence a rumor by denying it. You starve it by boring it. On that front, she was merciless. In the half-light between a decision and its consequences, Billy tried to be the man who didn't flinch. He called Jack, not to tattle about Kane's visit, but to triangulate. If Kane's cancellation was a feint, it meant he had a different doorway in mindless public, more permanent. If it was sincere, it meant the fight would take place on quieter footing contracts and confidences rather than headlines. Either way, Abbott Communications had to launch without the scent of panic. Jack, whose talent for stoicism is often mistaken for indifference, met him there. They didn't cuddle up to paranoia, they gave it a leash and a name. The plan did not change. The doors would open on schedule, the theme would sing, the cameras would hum, and the companion batoned. Yes, but publicly accountable by Designation would stand on the four corners Sally and Audra had poured: legacy, craft, clarity, and time. Kane didn't linger after dropping his paradox of a bomb. He left Billy's house with the same quiet he'd arrived, and for once, he didn't enjoy the power of ambiguity. The private reason behind his public cancellation gnawed at him with a ferocity that stripped cynicism of its pleasures. He had made the choice for the only audience that still terrifies him into honesty, his children, not because he was sure they'd see the nobility in it, but because he could not stomach crossing a threshold he could never explain to them later. A splashy return would give his enemies clean angles and his family dirty ones. A quiet recalibration would deny the former their traction and keep the latter out of the splash zone. He told himself it was strategy. In the small hours, when the house was loud with quiet, he admitted it was penance. By the time launch night arrived, the city had done what it always does. It turned its appetite into a costume and called it curiosity. The room glowed like a memory you can almost place. The graphics moved with the patience of a different century. The cameras kissed faces rather than hunted them. The copy honored the craft without embalming it. The first segment landed the way the best mid-century television used to land in a human chord you feel in your chest before your brain thinks a verdict. And in that spaced one between feeling and judgments and nothing shifted. Nick, watching from the back, saw the pulse in Phyllis's throat slow. Lily saw Devon exhale. Nate recognized a version of integrity he missed and wanted back. Audra understood, with a relief that tasted like pride, that the room didn't care whose last name sat on the letterhead as long as the work honored the audience. Sally watched the monitors the way a conductor listens to a halting as she went, ruthless and gentle at once. There were a dozen ways the night could have collapsed. A leak from Newman Media trying to steal the oxygen, a last-minute tantrum from an investor who wanted more spotlight, a stint from someone who thinks the only way to be seen is to misbehave. None of those things materialized. What mattered instead were the small pivots a dozen people made at once. Phyllis chose to be pleased instead of provoked. Nick chose to stay present rather than preemptive. Nate chose to stand with his family in a row that meant something. Audra chose to let the work speak and discovered it had a voice that didn't need hers on top of it. Billy chose not to weaponize Kane's ambiguity in the hours when doing so would have been easiest. And Kane, from a distance that was equal parts punishment and protection, chose to watch the broadcast alone and not call anyone when the opening sting reached for a part of him that remembers simpler promises. The town will chew on what comes next back as it must, because that's what it does. Nick will go another round with Phyllis tomorrow when she's rested, and the old reflexes itch again. Nate will show up on time, deliver more than he promised, and let the repetition of reliability do the quiet labor of repair. Audra will sign what she needs to sign and ignore the whispers about owning and being owned. She measured her authority in the finished edges of the work. Sally will already be building the second act before the first has finished echoing. Billy will sleep enough to dream, and in the dream he will not be in or out but necessary. And Kane Blint, complicated, newly cautious Kane will keep canceling what flatters him and choosing what costs him, not because he's turned sane, not because he fears Victor, not because he trusts Billy, but because somewhere between the noise and the silence he remembered that the only loyalty that ever really holds is the one your children believe when they're old enough to doubt you. That's the thing about Genoa city storms. The weather isn't what breaks people. It's the choices they make when the air goes still. Tonight, stillness worked like grace. Tomorrow, someone will pick a fight with it. But for a breath long enough to Matternick's steadiness steadied Phyllis, Nate's confession recalibrated the winter's axis. Audra's restraint made space for the future she says she wants. Sally's intervention drew a line between legacy and vanity, and Kane walked into Billy's house carrying news that sounded like retreat and felt like a dare. The launch proved what the city forgets every time it remembers how to gossip. Nostalgia isn't about going back. It's about carrying forward what's worth the wait. And sometimes, the only way to move a story along is to refuse the scene that would have made for better headlines and choose the one that will make for better memories. The line landed between them like a deadbolt thrown. It didn't matter anymore, he said. He'd decided not to pursue his original intention. And though the words were calm, they carried the weight of someone who had just shut a door on the only version of himself that knew how to kick doors open. Billy held his stare long enough to make the silence do the rest of the talking. The last time Kane announced a pivot this clean, chaos followed with a mop and a match. He told himself to treat the moment like a footnote and not a headline, but skepticism has muscle memory, and his did not disappoint. He cycled through the obvious challenge we now. Who benefits? Which pressure changed the weather and let Kane answer none of them, because the answer, apparently, was children. Kane wanted to rebuild with his kids, rebuild without the choreography, without the fanfare, without the performative contrition that always reads like a press release written in a mirror. If that was the point, Billy said, then fine, good luck, because the only audience that doesn't grade on a curve is the one that shares your last name, and if Kane thought Genoa City was unforgiving, he should try a dinner table where memory is the only witness. But skepticism is greedy, and Billy had one more question curling at the edges of his restraint. Did this mean Chancellor was fair game? The phrasing wasn't casual, it was a probe wrapped in a dare. Kane didn't blink. Find your own way, he said. It's yours for blunt words that sounded less like permission than a warning that no one would be there to catch the instruments if Billy started moving furniture in a room where every piece is bolted to a legacy. And because the universe enjoys choreography, Billy asked how Phyllis took the news, and Kane answered what Billy already suspected. Not well. You don't know what you just unleashed, Billy said with a grin that wasn't joy so much as anticipation, because Phyllis weaponizes turbulence the way other people weaponize facts. And if Kane had yanked a thread that kept 3 stories from unraveling at once, she would find out which thread it was and pull until the whole sweater confessed. Kane left on that note, not with the swagger of a man who had outmaneuvered an enemy, but with the careful gait of someone who had elected, for once, to leave a fight before it became a spectacle. His absence changed the air by degrees rather than by headlines, and that might have been the point all along. Sally arrived on the echo of the closing door, a wry question already on her mouth because rooms hold heat, and she recognized this particular temperature. She could smell the mix of adrenaline and unfinished thought that follows a visit from a man who insists he's done making moves while leaving fingerprints on every surface. Billy briefed her with the efficiency of someone who has finally learned that confiding early is cheaper than triage later. Kane says he's out. Kane says he's prioritizing his kids. Kane says Chancellor is not his problem and might be yours. Kane says Phyllis didn't like it. None of those sentences were new in this town, but the order was. Sally listened without reaching for the nearest moral, which is why Billy trusts her in exactly the way he distrusts almost everyone else. She doesn't sell comfort disguised as strategy. What is he actually doing? She asked, and they both acknowledged the boredom of repeating that question and the necessity of asking it again. They map possibilities with pencils instead of knives. If Kane has truly stepped away from a splashy return, the story becomes the absence and not the comeback. Who benefits from the vacuum? Which rumors stop returning phone calls when the target isn't wearing a name tag? Which boardrooms change their posture when a known disruptor chooses domestic gravity over corporate theater? If it's a feint, the breadcrumbs will be in motions no one is photographing yet. Counsel retained without announcements. Options exercised without press releases. Friends who start answering with calendar links instead of yes or no. Sally didn't have to be asked what to do with that. She offered it. The way a good editor offers a path rather than a pitch. If they could trace intent without pretending to read minds, see if they could build a timeline, check the filings. Listen for what stops happening now that Kane says he's out. They could write something that wasn't gossip dressed as courage. And if the story held, if the facts were facts and the questions were grounded in what anyone could verify, they wouldn't just drop a piece. They would stamp Abbott Communications onto the map as a company that doesn't confuse volume with value. Billy nodded because it wasn't just a media play. It was a thesis about how to operate in a town where spectacle is cheap and patience isn't. Meanwhile, across town, the first ripple of the very reaction Billy had forecast was already moving through a different room with red hair and a short fuse. Phyllis left a message for Kane that mistook urgency for clarity, which is what we all do when a feeling outruns a plan. "You cannot do this to me without a conversation. Call me." That was the gist with sharper edges. The part she didn't script was the part where Nick happened to be in range when the last sentence left her mouth. He didn't sneak, but he didn't announce himself either, which is a kind of honesty and a kind of sin. He stepped into the frame with that half-quiet he keeps for her when he knows that her next line could be a lifeline or a grenade, and asked what was happening. "Bad news," she said, not because she wanted to be evasive, but because names make everything heavier, and she was not ready to carry this in a way that let it be smelled by the whole town. He told her he had heard enough to know it involved Kane, and asked the question that contains 90% of the history between them. What has he done again? Then, layered on top of the practiced exasperation, the part that still trips both of them because it isn't protective so much as proprietary, told her he should have been the first call, not Kane. There is a version of this scene where Phyllis hears that line as a net and not a leash. Today was not that version. She took a breath that looked like a dare and told him that she reached for the closest lever that felt like it might move the thing without breaking it, and in the Venn diagram of her life, Kane sits in the overlap between problems she can fix and problems she can fuel. She admitted that what she just learned was an absence, not an attack. And that sometimes the worst news is a door closing rather than one flying open, because you can run through a crisis, but you cannot chase a retreat. Nick disassembled his frustration the way you take apart a watch carefully, with tools he reserves for exactly to people on Earth. He did not lecture her about boundaries, or about the hazards of using a man you don't trust as a switch you flip when the lights flicker. He did not convert his jealousy into policy. He reframed. If Kane was exiting stage left at the moment everyone had been bracing for him to storm center, then the risk wasn't to Phyllis's heart or to Billy's launch. The risk was tactical. Vacuums attract opportunists, and Kane's decision would create 5 within the week. He told her that if she wanted to help, she could do the thing she is better at than anyone knew the seams before the rest of them, see the fabric and call him first with the mat rather than calling Kane with the match. She countered with the truth that makes him forgive her before she earns it. She was trying to keep a dozen threads from tangling and reached for the one that used to answer on the first ring. The apology was not explicit, but it was there in the way her posture softened a notch and in the way she didn't reach for her phone while he was still talking. He didn't press the advantage. He never does, and that is why she lets him say the thing he always says when her horizon fills with storms. Breathe, wait, pick fights you intend to finish. Back at Billy's, the practical work resumed because the launch refused to care about who is up and who is out. Cameras still needed calibration, graphics still needed sign-off, and Sally still had 3 interviews to pivot from flattering profiles to reported pieces that could survive a week in the wild without being devoured by corrections. They turned Kane's visit into a checklist rather than a monologue. If Chancellor was suddenly in a lane without him, who would try to dart across it? And which of those drivers would forget that turn signals exist? If Phyllis had indeed been unleashed, as Billy so gleefully predicted, what would that energy do to the rumor ecosystem in the next 48 hours? And how could they starve the worst of it of bait? If the investigative path held water, which public records were clean and which ones would require a source willing to go on background with receipts? Sally, who has learned to love the boring work that keeps the sexy work from backfiring, laid out a reporting plan that made room for uncertainty. Then pretending certainty was a posture you could strike and hold. Timelines, filings, calls to regulators who don't return calls until they do. A few carefully chosen conversations with people who have no reason to protect Kane, and at least one conversation with someone who would Becca's hypocrisy reveals as much as honesty in a town like this. She reminded Billy, because it bears reminding, that the point of putting Abbott Communications on the map is not to put anyone else under it. It is to become the shop you trust when everyone else is selling adrenaline. Kane, for his part, did not turn his phone off after Phyllis's message, which is a measure of either courage or penance depending on your angle of approach. He let it sit on the counter like a live wire and forced himself to clean the kitchen until the habit of motion smoothed the edge of the urge to answer immediately. This was the discipline he had promised himself when he decided the children would be the gravity and not the alibi. You cannot rebuild a bridge by sprinting across it before the bolt set. He wrote a message he didn't send for lines that said exactly what a man says when he is trying not to apologize for the right thing. I am not doing this to you. I am doing it near you. And that difference matters. He saved it, unsent, because unsent messages are how we practice being better than our reflexes. Then he called one of the twins and listened more than he spoke, which is the hardest work he has ever done, and whichever way that conversation went. It must have done something to his bones, because when he hung up he didn't reach for another fight to keep from feeling the one he had chosen. The town will say tomorrow that nothing really happened today. That a man changed his mind about a return, and a launch rehearsed the same marks, and a woman left a voicemail, and a newsroom outlined a story it may or may not write. But that's why tomorrow's messes are often born today, because nothing happening is one character does the quiet work that decides what happens next. Billy will treat Kane's "It's Yours" as both an invitation and a trap, and will try, for once, to prove that he can tell the difference. Sally will build a coverage plan that assumes dignity is not a luxury item, and will keep sharpening it until it can cut noise without cutting people. Phyllis will pace, and then she will choose whether the unleashed creature is the one that gets her what she wants or the one that keeps her from recognizing it when it arrives. Nick will decide that being the first call is less important than being the one who answers, and he will prove it by answering again. And Kane, the man who finally said out loud that what he meant to do is not what he will do, will spend the next days discovering whether intention is still worth anything once you stop performing it. If Chancellor becomes fair game because a ghost stepped aside, then fair game will have to reckon with the fact that games stop being fun the minute the people who depend on you start keeping score. If Abbott Communications lands its shot because it chose reporting over rumor, the map will remember who drew its lines. And if the only real headline tonight is that restraint beats spectacle in a town that keeps betting the other way, then maybe that is news enough to change how everyone plays the next scene. Phyllis stood firm, eyes unwavering, as she told Nick that Kane saw it clearly they were kindred spirits, to souls drawn together not by romance but by recognition, and she believed, with all the conviction of someone clinging to a vision, that she could be the one to guide him back on course. Nick tried, truly tried, to dissuade her. He wasn't just worried about Kane's intentions. He was worried about the part of Phyllis that couldn't stop needing to fix things, especially things that looked like men spiraling. He urged her to think it through, to let go of the fantasy that she could redeem someone who wasn't asking to be saved. But she cut him off with one sharp breath and a simple order, "Louis, lay sigh," and so he did reluctantly, retreating not out of agreement, but because he knew she couldn't hear him right now. At Society, across town, a separate fracture was forming quieter, but no less consequential as Nate sat across from Lily and Devon and spoke the words that made it real. It was officially over between him and Audra Charles. Lily offered a gentle apology, not to fix things, but to acknowledge the weight of what had just been said. And then Nate already vulnerably took a step deeper and shared what had been eating at him from the inside out. Claire Newman had made accusations, serious ones, and though Audra denied them, she blamed Kyle, said he was the one pursuing Claire. That claim alone didn't sit right with Nate, but what gnawed deeper was the memory of how badly Audra had once wanted power. He remembered her hunger for status, for title, for visibility, same hunger that once attracted him and then quietly terrified him. That's why he couldn't shake the suspicion that Victor's offer might have been more than just a test, it might have been a handshake behind his back. Devon didn't let that pass without challenge. His tone sharpened as he asked if Nate was really willing to let her off the hook that easily, because in Devon's world, betrayal required consequence, especially when tied to Newman's schemes. There's no reason she had to agree to Victor's terms, he insisted, but Nate wasn't ready to accept that line. He admits if lit it he wasn't sure what to believe anymore, that maybe Audra had played him all along and he simply missed the cues. He recalled how she wouldn't let him join her in Nice, how her defenses had gone up the moment transparency was requested, and now, in hindsight, those choices looked less like strategy and more like guilt. "I hate to admit it," he finally said, the words bitter in his throat. But maybe you were both right about her from the beginning. And just as the weight of that confession settled over them, Lily's phone buzzed. It was Kane, casual as ever, asking if she'd watched the video. She hadn't. She told him she was busy, needed to get back to her meeting, and ended the call with the kind of clipped grace that only Lily could wield when her emotions were pressing against her professionalism. She gathered her things and left society, her mind already fragmenting between family, work, and the ghost of Kane's voice still vibrating in her ear. Moments later, Audra walked in unaware of what had just been said, unprepared for the cool that had gathered in her absence. She spotted Nate and Devin still seated, a quiet tension clinging to the edges of their conversation, and without a word, she picked up her takeout order and left as quickly as she came. The unspoken truth lingering like smoke in the air behind her. Whatever power she once held in Nate's heart was slipping away, and in Genoa City, perception fades slower than love. But it cuts deeper when it turns.